Right now, you are reading this on a screen. Billions of people share this planet with you. Cities stretch across every continent. But rewind the clock far enough, and almost none of that exists. Not the cities, not the billions, barely even you. Somewhere between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, the human species came close to disappearing entirely. Not close in a poetic sense, close in a mathematical one. Geneticists studying human DNA have found something strange buried in your cells. A bottleneck. A moment where the population of your ancestors shrank so small that the entire species nearly blinked out of existence. How small? Estimates vary, but some researchers, including population geneticist Naomi Wolf's contemporaries in the field of coalescent theory, have put the number as low as several thousand breeding individuals. Not several thousand per continent, several thousand total. Fewer people than fit in a modern sports stadium. Think about that for a second. Every person you have ever met, every stranger you have ever passed on the street, every name from every history book, all of it traces back through a genetic funnel so narrow it barely let anyone through. What almost killed everyone? The leading theory points to climate. Around 74,000 years ago, a volcano named Toba on the island of Sumatra erupted with a force unlike anything in recorded human history. It was not just an eruption, it was a supervolcano event, ejecting so much ash and sulfur into the atmosphere that sunlight itself was dimmed for years. Scientist Stanley Ambrose proposed in the 1990s that this eruption triggered a volcanic winter, a sudden and brutal cooling of the global climate. Crops, in the sense that early humans had them, failed. Game animals vanished, temperatures dropped, and the humans who were already living on the edge of survival were pushed even closer to the edge. This idea is called the Toba catastrophe theory. It is not universally accepted. Some researchers have found archaeological sites in Africa and India where human tools continue uninterrupted through the ash layer, suggesting some groups survived just fine. But the genetic evidence for a bottleneck still stands, even if the exact cause remains debated. Something squeezed the human population down to a sliver of what it once was. Here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. If that bottleneck had gone slightly differently, if a few hundred fewer people had survived, if one more brutal winter had hit at the wrong time, you might not exist. Not you specifically. The species. The whole branching tree of humanity that eventually produced every person who has ever lived, every language ever spoken, every civilization ever built, might have simply ended in a scattering of freezing caves. But it didn't end. And the reason it didn't end tells you something remarkable about what a human actually is. Anthropologist Curtis Marian has spent decades studying a specific stretch of the South African coastline, near a site called Pinnacle Point. His research suggests that a small population of humans survived the harshest stretch of this era by doing something unexpected. They turned to the sea. Shellfish, protected in tidal rock pools, do not disappear during a volcanic winter the way grazing herds do. They do not depend on sunlight-fed grasslands. They just sit there, waiting to be pried loose. Marian's excavations found evidence of humans systematically harvesting shellfish, along with early pigment use and sophisticated stone tools, right around this critical window. In other words, human survival did not come from being the strongest or the fastest or even the most numerous. It came from flexibility. A tiny population, cornered by catastrophe, adapted its entire way of finding food. That adaptability is the actual inheritance you carry. Not size, not strength. The ability to notice when the old strategy stops working and switch. This single trait, the willingness to abandon a failing plan, may be the closest thing to a superpower your species has ever had. And it did not stop with shellfish. As those survivors slowly rebuilt their numbers, something else happened. Genetic diversity, which had been crushed down to almost nothing, began to matter in a new way. A population moving through a bottleneck loses genetic variation. Less variation usually means less resilience, fewer options for adapting to new diseases or new environments. Yet humans, emerging from this near collapse, went on to spread into nearly every climate on Earth. Arctic tundra, desert, rainforest, high-altitude plateaus. A species that had almost vanished became a species that could live almost anywhere. Researchers studying this expansion, including geneticist Sarah Tishkoff, who has spent years mapping genetic diversity across African populations, have found that the deepest, oldest branches of the human family tree are still found in Africa today. Populations there carry more genetic variation than anywhere else in the world, a living record of the fact that humanity's roots and its closest brush with extinction both happened on that continent. Here is where it gets strange. You are not just distantly connected to those bottleneck survivors. You are directly descended from them. Every single trait you carry, your immune responses, your risk factors, your resilience to certain illnesses, passed through that narrow genetic funnel and came out the other side. The instincts that make you flinch at a strange noise in the dark. The parts of your brain that light up with anxiety when resources feel scarce. Some researchers argue these are not random quirks. They are inherited caution, tuned by ancestors who lived through a period when caution was the difference between surviving winter and not. This is why certain fears feel disproportionate to modern life. Why running out of food, even briefly, can trigger a disproportionate wave of stress in a brain that logically knows the grocery store reopens tomorrow. Why isolation feels almost physically painful even when you are perfectly safe. Your nervous system was shaped in an era when the group was survival, and there was no guarantee the group would remain large enough to survive. Psychologist John Cacioppo, who studied loneliness extensively before his death in 2018, argued that this exact wiring, the deep discomfort of social isolation, is a holdover from a time when being separated from the group was a death sentence. A lone individual during a bottleneck event, cut off from shared shelter, shared food, and shared warning systems had almost no chance. Your brain still treats disconnection like a 5-alarm emergency, because for a shockingly long stretch of your species' history, it was one. So the next time you feel a flash of unexplainable dread walking home alone at night, or a strange tightness in your chest when your phone battery dies and you feel cut off from everyone, you are not malfunctioning. You are running very old software. Software written during the leanest, most dangerous chapter your ancestors ever lived through. There is something almost impossible to fully absorb about this. The entire arc of human history, agriculture, cities, language, written record, empires, satellites, all of it happened after this bottleneck. All of it was built by descendants of a group small enough to fit inside a single village. If you traveled back and stood among them, shivering on a darkened coastline, prying shellfish from tidal pools under an ash-gray sky, you would be looking at almost the entire future of the human species compressed into a few thousand exhausted, hungry, remarkably adaptable people. They did not know they were the bottleneck. They did not know how close the end really was. They just kept adjusting, kept improvising, kept finding one more strategy when the last one stopped working. You are not just reading this because human history happened to go a certain way. You are reading this because a small, cornered population refused to run out of ideas. And somewhere in you, in the low hum of anxiety before a hard season, in the comfort you feel around other people, in the flexibility that lets you learn a new skill when an old one becomes useless, that same refusal is still running. Quietly, constantly, right now. You are not just reading this on a screen. You are the proof that the bottleneck did not close.